I still remember the sound the chapel doors made when they stayed closed. Not slammed, not locked, just unopened. It was a small place, the kind with wooden pews polished thin by decades of other people's joy, other people's families filling every seat. The air smelled like lilies and old hymnals, and I stood there in my dress, fingers curled around a bouquet I'd picked myself because no one else had offered. I kept looking toward the back, expecting footsteps, whispers, some last-minute rush of familiar faces. My mother, my father, my brothers, my aunt who never missed a birthday. I told myself they were late. Traffic, emergencies, life happens. That's what I'd been saying my whole life. But the minutes passed, and the music swelled, and the truth settled into my chest like a stone. They weren't coming. My husband, Daniel, squeezed my hand and didn't say a word. He didn't need to. We'd already had the conversation the night before, when my phone stayed silent except for a generic thumbs up from my youngest cousin. My mother had texted that morning, something vague about things being complicated and hoping I understood. I typed and deleted 10 different replies before finally writing, "I understand." I didn't, not really, but I was tired of asking people to choose me. Growing up, I was always the extra piece, the ambitious one, the dreamer. My family was practical, rooted, proud of stability and routine. My father worked the same job for 32 years and wore it like a badge of honor. My mother believed in keeping your head down and not wanting too much. I wanted too much. I talked about travel, about buildings and spaces and hospitality, about creating places where people felt welcome and seen. They called it unrealistic. Then they called it selfish. By the time I met Daniel, the distance between us felt normal, like background noise you learn to ignore. So when they RSVP'd no to my wedding, each message phrased differently but meaning the same thing, I told myself it was fine. I said we'd save money. I said we didn't need a crowd. I said love was enough. And it was, in that moment, because Daniel looked at me like I was the only person in the room, and the officiant's voice carried us forward, and we promised each other forever without witnesses from my side of the aisle. But later, when the photos came back and every picture showed empty space where my family should have been, something inside me cracked quietly. After the wedding, I stopped reaching out. Not dramatically, no speeches, no ultimatums. I just let the silence be what it was. I poured myself into work, into the small hospitality consulting business I'd been building on the side for years. I'd started with one struggling roadside motel, helping the owner rebrand, retrain staff, rethink what comfort could look like on a budget. Then another, then another. I listened to guests. I listened to housekeepers. I learned where money actually mattered and where kindness did. I slept 4 hours a night and ate most meals from gas stations. Daniel believed in me in a way that felt almost unreal. He never asked when I'd slow down. He asked how he could help. The first time someone suggested I open my own property, I laughed. It felt too big, too loud, too much like the dreams my family had warned me against. But I did it anyway. 1 hotel turned into 3, 3 into 8. We focused on mid-range comfort, clean lines, warm lighting, staff paid above industry average. We built a reputation quietly, steadily. No flashy launches, just consistency, just care. Years passed. My parents missed promotions, anniversaries, the birth of my daughter. They sent cards sometimes, generic, polite. I stopped expecting more. I found out my company had crossed the 100 million valuation the same way everyone else did. A friend sent me a link with too many exclamation points. A business magazine headline with my name in it, spelled correctly for once. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the screen while my coffee went cold. Daniel hugged me from behind, and my daughter asked if we were going to be on TV. I laughed, but my hands were shaking, not from pride, from the strange grief of realizing how far I'd come without the people who were supposed to cheer the loudest. The news cycle moved fast. Interviews, emails, congratulations from people I barely remembered. And then, late that night, after I'd finally put my phone face down and told myself I didn't care who noticed now, it buzzed. One message from my dad. I hadn't seen his name on my screen in years. My heart did something small and stupid, like it still believed. The text was simple. Saw the news. Proud of you. No apology, no acknowledgement of the wedding, just pride offered like a casual afterthought. I stared at it until the words blurred, feeling that old ache rise up, the one that always came with hoping he'd finally see me. I didn't reply that night, or the next day. I carried that message around like a weight, feeling every version of myself layered together. The girl who wanted approval, the bride who stood alone, the woman who built something anyway. I wondered what pride meant when it arrived only after proof, when love followed headlines, when absence was never explained. That was the moment I knew this story wasn't about success or revenge or even money. It was about choice, about who shows up when there's nothing to gain, and what you owe yourself when they don't. I didn't know yet how my family would try to step back into my life, or what they'd ask for, or how hard it would be to hold my ground without hardening my heart. I only knew that the doors that stayed closed on my wedding day had changed me forever, and no amount of public recognition could reopen them without cost. When I finally replied to my father's message, it wasn't because I'd found the right words. It was because I was tired of carrying them around unsaid. I typed, "Thank you," and stared at it for a long time before hitting send. 2 words, polite, distant, safer than honesty. His response came almost immediately, like he'd been waiting with the phone in his hand. "Would love to catch up sometime, maybe dinner?" The casualness of it made my chest tighten. Catch up, as if we'd missed a lunch, not years, as if he hadn't chosen absence when it mattered most. I told him I'd check my schedule. I didn't say yes, I didn't say no. I was learning the space between. The floodgates opened after that. My mother sent a long message full of heart emojis and exclamation points, talking about how she'd always believed me, how she'd kept every article she'd ever seen with my name in it. I wondered if she remembered the nights she told me to be realistic, to stop chasing ideas that made other people uncomfortable. My oldest brother called for the first time in almost a decade, his voice overly cheerful, asking about expansion plans like he'd been following along all these years. I listened more than I spoke, letting their words reveal themselves. Pride, curiosity, opportunity, very little accountability. Daniel watched all of this quietly. He never told me what to do. He just asked how I felt after every interaction, like that was the most important metric. Sometimes I didn't know. Sometimes I felt validated, like maybe I hadn't imagined the hurt. Sometimes I felt small again, like that girl at the chapel door, waiting. My daughter, too young to understand the history, asked why Grandma suddenly wanted to FaceTime. I told her families are complicated. I didn't want to teach her that love was conditional, but I didn't want to lie either. We agreed to meet my parents at a restaurant halfway between our cities, neutral ground, public. I arrived early, palms sweating, heart doing that ridiculous hopeful thing again. When they walked in, my mother rushed forward like no time had passed, hugging me too tightly, commenting on my hair, my weight, the way success seemed to agree with me. My father hung back a second, then smiled, the same reserved smile I'd spent years trying to earn. We sat, we ordered, we talked about weather and traffic and how busy everyone was. It felt like a performance, one we all knew by heart. Eventually, my father cleared his throat and said, "We always knew you'd do something big." The word always landed wrong. I asked him, gently, if that was true, why they hadn't come to my wedding. The table went quiet. My mother looked at her hands. My father sighed like he'd been waiting for this. He talked about disagreements, about not understanding my choices, about feeling shut out of my life. He didn't mention the unanswered calls, the dismissive comments, the way they'd made me feel like my dreams were an inconvenience. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I said, "I invited you. I showed up." My voice didn't shake. That felt like progress. They apologized, sort of, in that roundabout way people do when they're uncomfortable with full responsibility. "We did the best we could. We didn't realize how much it hurt you. We thought you didn't need us." I nodded because arguing felt pointless, but something inside me stayed guarded. Apologies that arrive after success feel different, heavier, less about repair, more about access. A week later, my brother emailed me a business proposal, not even a call, a PDF attachment outlining an idea for a boutique offshoot under my brand, something he'd manage locally. He framed it as family collaboration, as legacy. I stared at the screen, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. This was the other shoe dropping. Love had come with terms. Pride had come with plans. I declined politely, explaining that we weren't expanding that way and that I kept business and family separate for a reason. His reply was curt, defensive. He accused me of forgetting where I came from. That accusation followed me for weeks. It echoed in quiet moments, made me question myself in the dark. Had I changed too much? Had success hardened me? I talked it through with Daniel, with my therapist, with myself on long walks between properties. The answer was always the same. I hadn't forgotten. I remembered everything. That was why boundaries mattered. My parents tried again, inviting us to a family gathering, hinting at how nice it would be for my daughter to know her cousins. The guilt was subtle but sharp. I agreed to a short visit. I told myself it was for her, for closure, for giving them one more chance. The house looked the same, smelled the same, familiar in ways that made my chest ache. They showed off newspaper clippings, bragged to neighbors, told stories that centered them as supportive parents. I smiled when appropriate. I corrected gently when needed. I didn't stay long. On the drive home, my daughter fell asleep in her car seat, clutching a toy her grandmother had insisted she take. Daniel reached over and squeezed my knee. I realized I felt lighter leaving than arriving. That told me everything. The real test came when my father called a month later, his voice unsteady. He talked about retirement, about medical bills, about how proud he was again, about how family should help family. He didn't ask outright. He didn't have to. The implication hung heavy between us. I told him I loved him. I told him I hoped things worked out. I told him I wasn't comfortable mixing money and unresolved hurt. There was a long silence, then disappointment, then anger, then the line went dead. I cried after, not because I regretted my choice, but because saying no still hurt, because little parts of me still wanted his approval, his protection, his unconditional love. Healing isn't about erasing those wants. It's about not letting them run your life. The news cycle moved on. So did I. I focused on my team, on my family, on building spaces that welcomed people exactly as they were. I stopped checking my phone for messages that might never come. I stopped explaining my boundaries to people determined to misunderstand them. I learned that closure doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like peace. When I think back to my wedding now, to the empty seats and the closed doors, I don't feel shame anymore. I feel clarity. I built a life where presence matters, where showing up is the bare minimum. My family taught me that lesson without meaning to, and while the headlines may have brought them back into my orbit, they didn't get to rewrite the past or claim credit for the future. That part belonged to me.
After that last call with my father, the one that ended in silence heavy enough to feel physical, I thought the hardest part was over. I believed I'd drawn my line and that life would simply move forward on the other side of it. What I didn't realize was how deeply those old patterns lived inside me, how they waited for quiet moments to resurface. Success has a way of amplifying unresolved wounds. Every award, every article, every congratulatory handshake came with a whisper of the past asking, "Is this enough now?" I had to keep answering that question, sometimes daily. At work, things were expanding faster than ever. Investors wanted meetings, cities wanted partnerships. My name was suddenly treated like a credential, and that shift unsettled me more than it thrilled me. I remembered being dismissed in boardrooms, talked over, told to wait my turn. Now people leaned in when I spoke. I made it a point to notice who didn't have that privilege, to listen longer, to slow decisions that felt rushed by ego. I promised myself I wouldn't become the kind of person who only valued others when they were useful. At home, Daniel and I talked about the future in quieter ways, not about growth or profit, but about time, about what kind of parents we wanted to be, about what stories we wanted our daughter to remember. I told him I was afraid of becoming distant, of repeating the same emotional unavailability I'd grown up with, just dressed in different clothes. He reminded me that awareness was already a form of change. We scheduled non-negotiable family days, we cooked together, we let the world wait. My mother kept calling, leaving voicemails that swung between warmth and worry, pride and reproach. She said she felt like she was losing me again. I wanted to tell her she'd never fully had me, not because I didn't love her, but because I'd always been expected to shrink. Instead, I asked her what losing me meant to her. The question caught her off guard. She talked about fear, about aging, about regret. For the first time, I heard something close to honesty. It didn't fix everything, but it softened the edges. We started meeting just the two of us, coffee, short walks, no business talk, no rewrites of history. Sometimes it felt almost normal. Sometimes it felt like walking on thin ice. I learned to leave before resentment built, to end conversations while they were still kind. Boundaries aren't walls, they're doors you choose when to open. Then came the gala, a black tie event hosted by a hospitality association celebrating innovation and leadership. I'd been asked to give a keynote. I hesitated before accepting, knowing my parents would hear about it, knowing they might show up. They did. I spotted them in the audience, dressed formally, sitting together, their presence both grounding and distracting. As I spoke about inclusion, about the power of being welcomed, about the difference one person showing up can make, I felt the weight of my own words. I wasn't performing, I was confessing. Afterward, my father approached me slowly. He looked smaller than I remembered, older. He told me he'd never understood my world, but listening to me that night had made him realize how much he'd missed. He didn't ask for anything, he didn't make excuses, he just said he was sorry for not being there when it counted. The sincerity in his voice undid me. We stood there, awkward and quiet, two people bridged by time and regret. I thanked him. I told him that hearing that mattered. I didn't promise more than I could give. That apology didn't erase the past, but it changed the shape of it. I stopped carrying so much anger, not for him, for me. I allowed myself to grieve the version of family I'd never had, to mourn it fully instead of pretending it didn't matter. Grief, I learned, makes room for something else to grow. My brother remained distant. The rejection of his proposal had become a dividing line he wasn't ready to cross back over. I stopped chasing reconciliation there. Some relationships don't survive the truth, and forcing them only breeds resentment. I wished him well from afar. As months passed, the attention around my company settled into something sustainable. We opened a new flagship property, one designed with community spaces and local partnerships. On opening night, I watched guests mingle, staff laugh, children run through the lobby like it was their own living room. I felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. This was the legacy I cared about. Not headlines, not approval, presence. One evening, my daughter asked why Grandma and Grandpa hadn't come to her birthday party. The question was simple, honest. I told her they couldn't make it, and that sometimes grown-ups struggle with showing up, just like kids do.
She accepted that and went back to her cake. Children have a way of understanding without judgment. I hoped she'd keep that. I realized then that the cycle could end with me, that my family's inability to show up didn't have to define my daughter's story, that love could be consistent, reliable, unconditional. I could choose that every day. When I look at my phone now, I don't flinch at notifications. I don't measure my worth by who reaches out when the spotlight hits. I know who was there in the quiet. I know who stayed when there was nothing to gain. And I know who I am without needing anyone else to validate it. My family skipping my wedding was a wound that shaped me, but it wasn't the end of my story. The news about my company may have brought them back into my orbit, but it didn't give them ownership over my life. I built something from absence. I learned how to show up by learning how it felt when no one did. And that lesson, painful as it was, became the foundation of everything I'm proud of today. After the gala, something subtle shifted inside me. Not everything, not all at once, but enough that I noticed the difference in how I carried myself through the world. I stopped bracing for disappointment before every family interaction. I stopped rehearsing defenses in my head. I didn't suddenly trust without question, but I allowed space for complexity. People could hurt me and still be human. They could apologize and still not get full access. Both things could be true at the same time. My father and I began exchanging occasional messages, short updates, neutral territory. He asked about my daughter's school. I asked about his health. We avoided the past unless it surfaced naturally. When it did, we didn't rush to smooth it over. Silence was no longer an enemy. It became a pause we could sit in without panicking. I realized how much of my life I'd spent trying to fill silence with achievement, with explanation, with proof. Letting it exist felt like a small kind of freedom. My mother, on the other hand, struggled more visibly. She wanted closeness fast, like she was afraid time was running out. She invited us to holidays she'd skipped before. She talked about moving closer. Sometimes her eagerness felt like pressure, and I had to remind myself that her anxiety wasn't my responsibility to fix. I learned to say things like, "That doesn't work for us right now," without justifying or apologizing. Each time I did, my voice got steadier. At work, I faced a different kind of reckoning. With growth came scrutiny. A former colleague wrote an op-ed questioning whether my success was exaggerated, whether my brand was built on image more than substance. Years ago, that would have destroyed me. I would have spiraled, called my parents, begged them to reassure me. This time, I read it once, noted the inaccuracies, and let my team handle the response. The truth didn't need my panic to survive. I wondered what it would have been like to learn that lesson earlier, to have adults who modeled emotional steadiness instead of conditional approval. One afternoon, while reviewing designs for a new property, I caught myself smiling at a small detail, a reading nook near the lobby fireplace. Comfortable, inviting, something I would have loved as a child, a place to sit quietly without being asked to perform. It hit me then that so much of what I'd built was an unconscious response to what I hadn't received, places where people could just exist. That realization didn't feel sad, it felt purposeful. My daughter started asking more questions as she grew, about family, about why some grandparents came more than others. I answered honestly, in age-appropriate ways, always centering the idea that love should feel safe, that it should show up consistently. I watched her absorb those lessons effortlessly, without the baggage I'd carried for decades. There was relief in that, and pride. The real test of everything I'd learned came unexpectedly. My father had a health scare. Nothing life-ending, but serious enough to require surgery and recovery. My mother called, her voice shaking, asking if I could come. The old panic flared for a second, the instinct to drop everything to prove I was a good daughter. I paused. I checked in with myself. Then I went, but on my terms. I arranged coverage at work. I brought Daniel and my daughter for part of the visit. I stayed present without disappearing into obligation. At the hospital, I sat beside my father's bed and held his hand. He looked at me with something like awe, like he was seeing me fully for the first time. He told me he wished he'd been braver when I was younger, wished he'd supported me instead of trying to steer me. I told him I believed him. I didn't tell him it was okay. I told him it mattered that he said it now. There was a difference. During that visit, extended family surfaced too. Cousins who'd skipped my wedding, an aunt who said I was too ambitious. They hugged me, praised me, asked questions about hotels and money and travel. I answered politely, but kept my distance. I could feel the old dynamics trying to reassert themselves, success smoothing over discomfort. I didn't let it. I was no longer willing to trade access to myself for acceptance. When we left, my mother cried and asked if things would ever feel normal again. I told her we were building something new instead, something honest. Normal had never really worked for us. She didn't like that answer, but she didn't argue. That felt like progress. Back home, life resumed its rhythm. School drop-offs, staff meetings, quiet dinners. I noticed how little I thought about headlines now, how rarely I checked for external validation. The work still mattered, but it no longer defined me. I defined it. That shift felt like adulthood in its truest form. One evening, Daniel and I sat on the porch after putting our daughter to bed. The air was warm, the kind of night that invites reflection. He asked me if I regretted anything. I thought about the wedding, the empty seats, the years of silence. I thought about how painful it had been, how lonely. And then I thought about the strength that grew in that space, the clarity, the boundaries, the life we'd built. I told him I regretted how much I blamed other people for their limitations, not the path that followed. I realized then that my family skipping my wedding had been a message, even if they hadn't intended it that way. It told me exactly who would show up when there was no applause, and it forced me to learn how to show up for myself. The news about my company hadn't changed my worth, it had just revealed where some people placed theirs. I don't tell this story as a victory lap. I tell it because I know how many people are standing in quiet rooms right now, holding bouquets with no one watching, building dreams without applause, wondering if it means they don't matter. It does. Sometimes the absence is the lesson. Sometimes it's the beginning. Time has a way of revealing what's real by simply letting things unfold without interference. After my father's surgery, there was a brief stretch where my parents reached out more consistently. Updates, check-ins, invitations that felt genuine, not strategic. I didn't mistake it for transformation, but I allowed myself to appreciate the effort for what it was. Healing, I'd learned, doesn't arrive as a grand apology and a sudden personality shift. It comes in small, imperfect movements, and you decide which ones you're willing to meet halfway. At the same time, something else began to surface in my extended family. Whispers at first, then comments passed through relatives who still spoke freely to one another. There was talk about inheritance, about what my success meant for the family, about how I'd be positioned someday to help everyone. It wasn't said to my face, not directly, but I could feel it in the way conversations tilted, in the careful compliments that lingered a little too long on the word resources. It reminded me why distance had once been necessary. I addressed it the only way I knew how, calmly, directly. At a family gathering I'd agreed to attend for an afternoon, I said out loud that my work supported my immediate family and my employees, and that I wasn't a financial safety net for unresolved relationships. The room went quiet. A few people looked offended. A few looked relieved. My mother looked embarrassed. My father said nothing. I didn't fill the silence. I'd finally learned that silence could hold truth without my help. After that, the invitations slowed, not disappeared, but thinned, and with that thinning came an unexpected peace. I hadn't realized how much energy it took to manage other people's expectations until they were no longer mine to carry. I poured that energy back into my life, into mentoring young women in hospitality who reminded me of myself at 25, into designing training programs that emphasized dignity and growth, into being present for bedtime stories and scraped knees and school plays. One afternoon, a journalist asked me in an interview how it felt to prove everyone wrong. The question irritated me more than I expected. I told her I hadn't built my company to prove anything. I built it because I saw a need and believed I could meet it with care. Proving people wrong still centers them. I'd spent too much of my life doing that already. She didn't quote that part, but saying it out loud mattered anyway. My mother called me later that week, her voice tentative. She said she'd been thinking about the wedding, about how she'd convinced herself it wasn't a big deal because admitting it mattered would have meant admitting she'd failed me. It wasn't a clean apology. It was defensive, still wrapped in her own fear. But there was awareness there. I thanked her for telling me. I told her the wedding had mattered because it was about being chosen, not celebrated. She cried quietly. We didn't resolve everything. We didn't need to. The truth had finally been named. I noticed something shift after that conversation, not in her behavior immediately, but in mine. I stopped hoping she'd become the mother I'd needed. I accepted the one she was capable of being now. Acceptance isn't surrender, it's clarity, and clarity is kinder than constant disappointment. At work, we faced our first real crisis. A regional manager made decisions that compromised staff well-being in favor of short-term savings. When it came to my attention, I didn't delegate the response. I went there myself. I listened to employees who were scared to speak. I made changes. I let someone go. The decision made headlines framed as decisive leadership, but for me, it was personal. I knew what it felt like when authority figures chose convenience over care. I wasn't going to replicate that, not on my watch. That night, after I got home late, my daughter was still awake waiting for me with a drawing she'd made of our family, all three of us holding hands, standing in front of a big building with lots of windows. "That's your hotel," she said proudly. I corrected her gently. "It's one of them." She smiled and said, "It looks warm." That word stayed with me. Warm. That was the goal. My father and I had coffee a few weeks later, just the two of us, no agenda. He told me stories from his childhood I'd never heard, about scarcity, about being taught that survival meant conformity. I began to understand that his resistance to my dreams had been fear masquerading as guidance. Understanding didn't excuse the hurt, but it softened the resentment. I told him I was proud of the life I'd built. He said he was too, without qualifiers. It was the first time it didn't feel borrowed from a headline. Still, I didn't invite him into every part of my life. I didn't need to. Connection doesn't require full access. It requires respect, and we were learning that slowly, awkwardly, like beginners. There was a moment months later when I stood in the lobby of our newest property during a soft opening. The staff was nervous. Guests were arriving. I caught my reflection in the glass doors and barely recognized the woman looking back. Confident, grounded, tired but fulfilled. I thought about that younger version of me standing in a chapel with empty seats, wondering if she'd misjudged her own worth. I wish I could reach back through time and tell her that absence isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's redirection. My family never fully became what I once hoped they would be. Some bridges were rebuilt with limits, others remained broken, and some I chose not to repair at all. What I gained instead was discernment, the ability to tell the difference between love and obligation, between pride and performance, between reconciliation and access. When my company crossed another milestone, quietly, without the fanfare of the first, I didn't tell anyone outside my inner circle. I celebrated with a small dinner at home, candles, laughter, my daughter falling asleep at the table. That felt like success. The text from my father years ago had reopened an old wound, but it had also forced me to decide who I wanted to be on the other side of it. I chose honesty. I chose boundaries. I chose to build a family culture where showing up wasn't conditional on achievement. If you're listening to this and you're still waiting for someone to see you, to choose you without proof, I want you to know something. Their inability doesn't define your value, and their late arrival doesn't obligate you to hand them the keys to your life. You get to decide what access looks like. You get to decide what love costs. For me, that decision changed everything. By the time the novelty of my success faded for everyone else, I had already settled into a quieter understanding of it myself. The money, the growth, the recognition, those things stopped feeling like milestones and started feeling like tools. Useful, powerful, but not sacred. What felt sacred were the small choices I made every day about who I let close and how I showed up when it mattered. My parents remained on the edges of my life, neither fully in nor completely out. There were stretches of warmth, followed by long pauses. I stopped interpreting those pauses as rejection. I saw them for what they were, limits. Limits shaped by fear, habit, and a lifetime of emotional shortcuts. I could acknowledge them without trying to push past them. That was new and freeing. One afternoon, my mother sent me a photo from her phone. It was an old picture I'd never seen before. Me, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of a cardboard model of a hotel I'd built for a school project. Crude walls, hand-drawn windows, a crooked sign taped to the top. On the back, in my own childish handwriting, it said, "A place where everyone is welcome." I stared at that photo for a long time. She wrote beneath it, "I forgot about this. I guess you've always known." I didn't reply right away. I let the moment breathe. Then I wrote back, "I think I did." That exchange didn't heal our relationship, but it stitched something together inside me. Proof that my dreams hadn't come out of nowhere. Proof that I hadn't imagined my own consistency. At work, I started stepping back intentionally, not because I was tired of building, but because I wanted to see what happened when I trusted the people I'd poured into. The company didn't fall apart, it thrived. Watching others lead with the same values I'd fought to protect filled me with a satisfaction no headline ever had. Legacy, I realized, wasn't about being indispensable, it was about being replicable. That lesson echoed in my personal life, too. I didn't need to be the emotional anchor for everyone around me. I didn't need to absorb disappointment quietly or smooth over discomfort. I could model something different. My daughter watched everything. The way I said no, the way I apologized when I was wrong, the way I didn't chase approval anymore. Parenting has a way of forcing honesty. She deserved clarity, not confusion wrapped in politeness. One evening, after a long day, she asked me why some people only say nice things when others are watching. The question startled me. I asked her what made her think that. She shrugged and said she noticed it at school, at birthday parties, even sometimes with family. I told her that some people are still learning who they are when no one is clapping. She thought about that and nodded, like it made sense. I hoped it would stick. My father surprised me one day by showing up unannounced at one of our properties. He wasn't there to inspect or to boast, he just wanted to see it. I walked him through the lobby, the rooms, the staff areas. I watched him listen as employees spoke about training and support and growth. He didn't interrupt, he didn't correct. At the end, he said quietly, "You built this the way I never knew how." There was no envy in his voice, just awe. That moment mattered more than any praise he'd ever given me. We sat in the lobby cafe afterward, 2 coffees growing cold between us. He told me he'd spent years believing that love was proven through sacrifice and endurance, not presence. that showing up emotionally had never been modeled for him. I told him I understood that and that it didn't erase the impact. He nodded. He didn't argue. That, too, was progress. Still, there were setbacks. Old habits resurfaced, guilt slipped into conversations, expectations crept back in under the guise of concern. When they did, I named them gently and stepped back. I no longer waited until resentment forced distance. I acted early, proactively. That was something therapy, time, and a lot of self-forgiveness had taught me. The anniversary of my wedding came and went quietly one year. No posts, no calls from family. Daniel and I spent it at home, cooking together, laughing about how nervous we'd been that day. I admitted that part of me still wished my parents had been there. He didn't try to fix it. He just said, "Of course you do." Being seen like that, without being corrected or minimized, felt like the truest form of love. I began sharing my story more openly in mentoring spaces, not as a tale of triumph, but one of discernment. Young entrepreneurs often asked how to earn respect from people who doubted them. I told them respect earned through success is fragile. Respect built on boundaries lasts longer. I could see the relief on their faces, like permission had been granted. One of those conversations led to a letter from a woman who said her words had helped her walk away from a family business that was draining her. She wrote that she finally understood that loyalty didn't mean self-erasure. I cried when I read it, not because I felt important, but because pain, once understood, can become a bridge instead of a burden. My relationship with my brother remained strained. We exchanged occasional updates, nothing deep. I accepted that he might always see my boundaries as rejection. That was his work to do, not mine. Letting go of the need to be understood by everyone felt like shedding a heavy coat I'd worn too long. As the years stacked up, my company became known less for its valuation and more for its culture. Turnover was low, guest loyalty was high. That mattered to me. It felt aligned. I wasn't trying to build something impressive anymore. I was trying to build something honest. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that text from my father when the news first broke, how it stirred everything, how it forced a reckoning I'd avoided for years. I don't resent it anymore. It arrived when I was finally strong enough to respond differently. My family skipping my wedding was a heartbreak I carried quietly for a long time, but it taught me how to recognize real presence when it arrived. It taught me that showing up late doesn't entitle anyone to front row seats, and it taught me that the family you build through intention can be just as powerful as the one you're born into. If there's one thing I know now, it's this: success doesn't heal old wounds, but clarity does. And once you have it, you don't give it up. Not for pride, not for guilt, not even for love that comes with conditions. As the years moved forward, the sharp edges of my story softened, but they never disappeared completely. They became part of the landscape, visible, familiar, no longer dangerous to touch. I learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means remembering without bleeding. And that distinction changed how I approached everything, especially my family. My parents aged in small, noticeable ways. My father's steps slowed. My mother forgot details she once held tightly. Time, the great equalizer, stripped away some of the authority they'd once carried in my mind. I no longer saw them as judges of my choices, but as people shaped by fear and limitation, doing the best they could with what they had. That understanding didn't erase the past, but it gave it context, and context, I discovered, is a powerful form of peace. We developed a rhythm that worked for us: phone calls once a month, visits a few times a year, no surprise drop-ins, no financial entanglements. When conversations drifted toward guilt or expectation, I redirected them gently or ended them early. At first, it felt unnatural, almost cruel. Then it felt responsible. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was protecting the life I'd built. My mother once asked me if I thought things would have been different if they'd come to my wedding. The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told her the wedding wasn't the cause of the distance. It was the moment the distance became undeniable. She nodded slowly, like someone absorbing a truth too heavy to rush. She didn't argue, she didn't defend herself. That silence felt like acknowledgement. My daughter grew older, more observant, more curious. She noticed patterns without naming them. She asked why we didn't see certain relatives often. I told her families don't all look the same, and closeness isn't measured by blood alone. I watched her accept that without resistance, and I felt a quiet pride. She was learning flexibility without insecurity. That mattered more to me than any tradition. At work, I turned down an opportunity that would have doubled our valuation, but required compromises I wasn't willing to make. The board was split. Advisors warned me I was letting emotion cloud my judgment, but it wasn't emotion, it was alignment. I'd spent too long chasing validation to mistake clarity for fear. Walking away felt like integrity. That decision sparked another wave of commentary online. Some praised it, some criticized it. My family didn't comment at all, and for the first time, I didn't notice the absence. I realized I'd stopped scanning the crowd for familiar faces. I'd learned to stand steady whether anyone was watching or not. My father surprised me again, this time with a handwritten letter. His handwriting was shaky, the words carefully chosen. He wrote about regret, about wishing he'd understood sooner that success wasn't a betrayal of values, but an expression of them. He apologized, not for specific events, but for a pattern of distance. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't complete, but it was sincere. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not as a trophy, but as a marker. We'd come as far as we were going to come. I didn't respond right away. When I did, I thanked him and told him I appreciated the effort it took to write it. I didn't reopen old wounds. I didn't ask for more. I accepted the offering as it was. That felt like closure, even if the story itself remained unfinished. My brother eventually reached out again, years after his proposal had been rejected. His message was brief, stripped of pretense. He said he'd been angry because my boundaries forced him to confront his own dependence on approval. He didn't ask for collaboration, he didn't ask for money, he just wanted to talk. We met for coffee. It was awkward, honest, limited. We didn't become close, but we became civil. Sometimes that's the win. I stopped telling my story with an edge. The anger had burned itself out, leaving behind something steadier. I spoke about it now with nuance, aware that people are rarely villains in their own minds. That awareness didn't make me softer in my boundaries, it made me clearer in my compassion. One evening, after a long walk, I sat alone in one of our hotel lounges after closing. The lights were low, the space was quiet. I thought about how many people had passed through places like this, celebrations, losses, beginnings, endings. I realized I'd built something that held other people's stories, not just my own. That felt like the truest success. I imagined my younger self again, not at the wedding this time, but earlier, sitting at a table covered in construction paper, drawing windows and doors, imagining a place where everyone belonged. I wished I could tell her that belonging isn't something others grant you. It's something you build, piece by piece, with intention. My family didn't skip my wedding because I wasn't worthy. They skipped it because they didn't know how to show up for a version of me they couldn't control. That truth took years to accept, but once I did, it freed me from carrying their limitations as my burden. If you're listening and you've been waiting for a phone call, an apology, a sign that you matter, hear this. Your worth is not suspended until someone else recognizes it. Your life does not pause while others catch up. You are allowed to move forward without permission. I moved forward, slowly, deliberately, with love and limits in equal measure, and in doing so, I built a life that didn't need a crowd to feel complete.
There came a point when my story stopped feeling raw and started feeling settled, like a photograph that had finally faded into softer tones. Not erased, just gentler. I no longer introduced myself to the world through what my family had done or failed to do. I introduced myself through what I was building now, through how I chose to live. That shift didn't happen overnight. It arrived quietly, the way real change usually does. I noticed it first in how I reacted to praise. Compliments no longer made my chest tighten with that old urgency, that need to hold on to approval before it disappeared. I could accept kind words without trying to convert them into proof of worth. I could let them pass through me instead of defining me. That alone felt like a miracle. My parents remained present in limited, manageable ways. Holiday calls, birthday messages, occasional visits that stayed carefully within the boundaries I'd learned to protect. There were moments of warmth that felt genuine, unforced, and moments of awkwardness that reminded me why the boundaries existed in the first place. I stopped seeing that tension as failure. Relationships don't have to be perfect to be real. They just have to be honest. One year, my mother asked if we could host a small family dinner at one of our properties. Not a public event, not a showcase, just a meal. I hesitated. Old instincts flared. Was this about image, about access, or was it simply a request to share space? I sat with the question instead of reacting to it. Then I agreed with conditions. No announcements, no extended guest list, no business talk. She accepted them without argument. That alone told me how far we'd come. The dinner was fine. That was the word that kept coming to mind. Not magical, not painful, just fine. We ate, we talked about mundane things. My daughter showed my parents her favorite book. My father asked thoughtful questions about my life without redirecting the conversation to himself. When the evening ended, there were hugs that felt sincere, and when they left, I didn't feel hollow. I felt complete. That was new. At work, I shifted my focus towards sustainability of people, not just profit. I invested in leadership development programs, mental health resources, flexible schedules. I knew what burnout looked like. I'd lived it for years under a different name. I wanted my company to be a place where ambition didn't require self-erasure. Watching others thrive without sacrificing themselves became one of my greatest joys. A younger colleague once asked me how I'd learned to lead without needing to be liked. The question made me smile. I told her I'd spent a lifetime being liked conditionally, and it taught me how empty that approval could feel. Leadership, I explained, wasn't about applause. It was about trust. She nodded like something clicked. Moments like that reminded me why sharing my story mattered. My daughter reached an age where she began to ask deeper questions, not just about family, but about fairness, belonging, and why some people hurt others without meaning to. I answered as honestly as I could, always emphasizing choice, that we can't control how people treat us, but we can choose how we respond. That kindness doesn't mean tolerance of harm, that love doesn't require losing yourself. Watching her absorb those ideas felt like watching a cycle quietly break. There were still moments when the past surprised me. A wedding invitation from a distant cousin, a photo memory that popped up unexpectedly, a song that played in a grocery store and transported me back to that chapel, to the sound of doors staying closed. When those moments came, I let myself feel them without judgment. Pain acknowledged loses its power. One afternoon, I found myself standing alone in a ballroom before a major conference, lights dimmed, chairs neatly arranged. I imagined it filled with people, with voices and movement, and then I imagined it empty. Both versions felt okay. That realization settled deep in my bones. I was no longer afraid of empty rooms. I knew how to stand in them. My father called me one evening, his voice soft, reflective. He told me he'd been thinking about my wedding again. He said he wished he could go back and choose differently.
I didn't rush to reassure him. I didn't tell him it was fine. I told him I appreciated his honesty and that regret, when faced, can become something useful. He thanked me. We ended the call without heaviness. I realized then that forgiveness didn't have to look like closeness. It could look like understanding without surrender, like compassion without self-betrayal, like letting people be who they are without needing them to become who you needed. That kind of forgiveness felt adult, grounded, sustainable. My brother sent a photo one day, his kids at a park laughing. He wrote, "Hope you're well." No subtext, no ask. I replied the same way. Sometimes healing shows up as neutrality, as peace without intimacy, and that's okay. As my company matured, I stepped further into an advisory role. I spent more time writing, mentoring, and speaking quietly to rooms that didn't need convincing. I told my story not as a cautionary tale or a redemption arc, but as an example of what happens when you stop negotiating your worth. I watched people listen with recognition, with relief. That connection mattered more than applause ever had. Looking back now, the headline about my $100 million hotel chain feels almost irrelevant. It was never the point. It was just the moment the world looked my way long enough for old wounds to surface. What I did with that moment, that's what mattered. I chose clarity over access, integrity over nostalgia, peace over performance. My family skipping my wedding hurt deeply, but it also forced me to build a life where presence wasn't begged for, it was expected, where love didn't arrive late with conditions attached, where success didn't need witnesses to feel real. If you're still carrying the weight of people who didn't show up, I hope you hear this clearly. You don't have to wait for them to change before you live fully. You don't have to keep a seat open forever. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is close the door gently and build something beautiful on the other side of it. That's what I did, and it changed everything. By the time I reached what most people would call the peak of my career, I'd already learned that peaks are quieter than we imagine. There were no fireworks, no sudden sense of arrival, just a steady awareness that I was living inside choices I'd made deliberately, and that nothing about my life felt borrowed anymore. That sense of ownership was subtle, but it was everything. My relationship with my parents settled into something stable, if limited. We stopped circling the same old arguments. They stopped trying to redefine my boundaries as distance. I stopped hoping they'd suddenly become different people. Instead, we met where we were. Sometimes that place felt warm, sometimes it felt formal. Both were manageable. Neither controlled me. One weekend, my parents came to visit our home for the first time. Not for a holiday, not for an event, just a visit. My mother commented on how calm the house felt. My father lingered in the backyard, watching my daughter play. There was no grand moment, no speech, but I noticed how they followed my lead, how they waited instead of directing. That shift mattered more than words ever could. Later that evening, after they'd gone, Daniel asked how I felt. I searched for the answer. Relieved, proud, a little sad, mostly at peace. Peace had become my metric for everything. If a choice disrupted it, I reconsidered. If a relationship required me to abandon it, I declined. That clarity simplified my life in ways success never had. At work, I officially stepped down from day-to-day leadership, transitioning into a chair role. The announcement was met with surprise, even concern. People asked if I was bored, if I was done building. I smiled and told them I was building differently now. I wanted to create space for others and for myself. Letting go didn't feel like loss. It felt like trust. With more time, I began writing in earnest, not for publication at first, just for myself. I wrote about the wedding, about the text from my father, about the strange ache of being seen only after proving something. Writing gave shape to emotions I'd carried quietly for years. It helped me see the through line clearly. I hadn't been abandoned, I'd been underestimated, and I'd internalized that longer than I should have. Eventually, some of that writing found its way into talks, into essays, into conversations that mattered. People reached out, sharing stories of empty seats and late apologies, of success that complicated grief instead of healing it. I answered when I could. I reminded them, as much as myself, that recognition doesn't retroactively make neglect okay. It just reveals where value was misplaced. My daughter entered her teenage years with a confidence I didn't have at her age. She challenged me, asked hard questions, tested boundaries, and through it all, she never doubted my presence. I was there, not perfectly, but consistently. That was the difference. That was the legacy. One night, she asked me if I was close to my parents when I was young. I told her the truth, that closeness isn't just about proximity, it's about safety. She thought about that and said she felt safe with us. I had to excuse myself to the kitchen after that. Some victories are quiet and overwhelming all at once. My father's health declined slowly over time. Nothing dramatic, just the gradual narrowing of his world. I visited when I could. We talked about ordinary things, sometimes about the past, sometimes about nothing at all. Near the end, he told me he was glad I hadn't needed him to become someone he wasn't. He said watching me build my life without shrinking had taught him something he didn't know he needed to learn. I held his hand and told him that mattered to me, and it did. After he passed, there was no unresolved storm of grief, just a steady sadness layered with acceptance. I mourned what was, I mourned what wasn't, and I let both exist without trying to rank them. That felt honest. My mother leaned on me more during that time. I supported her within my limits. I didn't disappear into the role of fixer. I stayed present without losing myself. That balance, once impossible, now felt natural. Growth doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply shows up when you need it most. At the memorial, distant relatives spoke about my father with reverence. Some mentioned my success as if it were part of his story. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. I knew the truth. My life wasn't a reflection of his choices. It was a response to them. That distinction mattered. In the months that followed, I felt a strange lightness, like a chapter had closed without slamming shut. I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone anymore, not to the world, not to my family, not even to myself. I'd already lived the answer. Looking back, the day my family skipped my wedding was never about rejection alone. It was about revelation. It showed me who I was without their approval. It forced me to become someone who could stand alone without becoming hard, someone who could build without bitterness, someone who could love without surrendering herself. If you're still in the middle of your story, still waiting for people to show up the way you hoped they would, I want you to know this. Sometimes they don't. And sometimes that absence is the very thing that teaches you how to become whole, not hardened, whole. I didn't get the family I imagined on my wedding day, but I built the life I needed afterward. And in the end, that life showed me something powerful. You don't need everyone to witness your beginning for it to be real. You just need the courage to keep going when the room is empty. In the years that followed my father's passing, life didn't slow down so much as it settled. The urgency I once carried, the need to justify, to explain, to be understood, faded into something quieter and sturdier. I woke up each morning no longer bracing for disappointment or scanning the horizon for approval. I simply lived inside the life I'd built, and that life held me without question. My mother adjusted in her own way. Some days she reached for closeness with a tenderness that felt new, almost fragile. Other days she retreated into old habits of silence and self-protection. I stopped trying to manage those shifts. I showed up when I could. I stepped back when I needed to. Loving her no longer required me to abandon myself, and that alone felt like a small miracle. My daughter grew into herself with a confidence that still catches me off guard. She speaks her mind. She asks hard questions. She expects presence, not promises. When she looks at me, there's no calculation in her eyes, no wondering what version of herself she needs to be to earn my attention. She already knows she has it. Every time I notice that, I think about the empty seats at my wedding and how different her beginning will be because of them. The company continued on, strong and steady, even without me at the center of it. Watching that happen affirmed something I'd long suspected. I was never meant to be the point. I was meant to be the foundation. The culture we built outlived my daily involvement, and that felt like the truest success I could imagine. Buildings can change names. Numbers can rise and fall. Values, when embedded deeply enough, endure. Occasionally, someone still brings up that headline from years ago, the one about the valuation, the one that made my father text me after so much silence. I smile politely when it happens, but it doesn't stir anything in me anymore. That moment served its purpose. It forced a reckoning. It showed me who came running when the lights turned on and who had already been there in the dark. Daniel and I celebrated another wedding anniversary quietly, the way we always do now. No spectacle, no posts, just us sitting across from each other, remembering who we were and who we've become. He once told me that my greatest strength wasn't resilience, but discernment, the ability to know what to carry forward and what to set down. I think he's right. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the version of myself who believed that being chosen by family was the final proof of worth. I feel a tenderness toward her now. She did the best she could with the information she had. She didn't know yet that worth isn't confirmed by attendance or applause or pride offered after the fact. Worth is intrinsic. It doesn't arrive late. It doesn't wait for headlines. If I could speak to her now, I'd tell her this. You're not being abandoned. You're being redirected toward people who can meet you where you are, toward a life that won't ask you to shrink, toward a version of love that shows up without conditions. My family never fully became the witnesses I once hoped they'd be, and that's okay. Witnessing my own life fully, honestly, without distortion, turned out to be enough. More than enough. I tell this story not to shame my family and not to elevate myself, but to name something many people carry quietly. The grief of being unseen, the confusion of being valued only after proving something, the strange loneliness of success that arrives without the people you wanted to share it with. These experiences don't make you bitter by default. They make you discerning if you let them. When my family skipped my wedding, it felt like the end of something. In truth, it was the beginning of a life built on intention instead of expectation, on presence instead of performance, on love that didn't need convincing. So if you're listening to this and you're still holding an invitation that went unanswered, literal or metaphorical, hear me clearly. You don't need to wait for anyone to show up before you begin. You don't need witnesses to validate your joy. You don't need late pride to confirm your worth. Build anyway. Love anyway. Choose yourself anyway. Because sometimes the people who miss your beginning don't get to define your ending. And sometimes the most powerful family legacy you can create is simply this: showing up where it matters, even when no one taught you how. That's the life I built, and I wouldn't trade it for anything.